everyone. Welcome to the Psychology and Spirituality, a Bridge to a Better Life discussion. I'm your host, Marcia Trajano, and with me is Peter Hayes, who is the president of Spiritist Group Love and Light in Newark, New Jersey. Most of us prefer to get through our days without ending up in an argument, right? We kind of look forward for a day of harmony, understanding, collaborative, or even constructive interactions with, oh, what, family, colleagues, neighbors, whomever. Unfortunately, Peter, we live in a time of such extreme social and political polarization. I'm wondering if asking for all of us to get along is even realistic anymore. But before we address that, let me go ahead and tell everyone if this is the first time we are watching this podcast like program, please note that the program, the Psychology and Spirituality Weekly Talks, are based on the works by Joanna de Angelis, and we're here to offer a safe space to confront, compare, correlate, and expand spirituality concepts from a psychological lens and bringing insights into, oh, having a better life, right? Helping us live better. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Spiritist Group Love and Light. And to know more about that organization, visit www.loveandlightnj.org. The overall program is sponsored by several organizations. They are United States Spiritist Federation, TV Mansão do Caminho, International Spiritist Council, and AMI Brazil. Make sure you hit subscribe if you haven't already done so. And if you'd like to check out other channels or more information about what we're doing, please check us out at www.spiritist.us. We'd love to hear from you. So please write down your thoughts, your comments, your feedback, anything. And if you have any questions, perhaps we can get to those at a later episode. Peter, I start talking about this, oh, so polarized society. It is a time that it feels like, I don't know, everything is a source of a conflict. But what is a conflict, right? And if you go into just a dictionary, there's several definitions of conflict, and one of the most literal translation, or I'm sorry, of definition is really it's the competitive or opposing action of incompatible, right? So it's some sort of antagonistic state where perhaps divergent ideas, interest, or even personalities just create that conflict, like a conflict of interest. It can also be defined as the mental struggle, and this is really important, right? The mental struggle that results from incompatible or opposing needs, drives, wishes, oh, inner and outer, external or internal demands. So I would like for us, Peter, to talk to today about these type of conflicts, those that result from the opposing needs and demands from our lives. Can we talk about that? And do you want to go ahead and say something about the subject? The mic is yours.
Okay. I think I'd like to start with a slightly different other question, which
Okay.
is which is should we be afraid of conflict?
Hmm.
The goal of happiness to eradicate conflict from our lives so that we're always serene and tranquil and so forth.
I love that. Right? Should we be robot like, happy, zen all the time, right?
Perpetual state of Zen, exactly.
Yes.
It's impossible to eliminate conflict from our existence. And maybe that makes a lot of people fearful. But when we talk about conflict, You mentioned that conflict can be opposing forces. Conflict can also just mean getting from one place to another. Conflict can mean all the challenges that we have, both physical and emotional, which can certainly be happening with others around us or strangers we come into contact with. It could also be within ourselves, our own conflicts. Are we afraid of doing certain things? Do we hold ourselves back in certain ways? Do we have a lot of negativity within us, which is certainly what psychology tries to help us with?
Yeah.
So conflict means a lot of different things. It's both internal and external that way. And even if we make some strives and things that maybe troubled us in the past don't bother us so much now,
Hmm.
does that mean there won't be other conflicts that come our way? Do we have to go looking for conflict because we somehow think that it makes us stronger? I would say no, because we're going to, I think the point is that conflict is unavoidable in many ways, but it also can be avoided in others.
Can you explain to that for me, Peter, how it can be avoided?
Well, when we talk about conflict between people, like
Hmm.
current political climate, as you were mentioning, I'm going to do a very simplified version of this, but in developmental psychology, one of the things it talks about is different levels of cognitive development, which often centers around dualistic thinking. Lower levels of cognitive development would be my opinion of things is right, and those of you who disagree with me are just completely and totally wrong. End of subject. Right? So at the lower end of that spectrum is people who, for those who don't agree with them, they must be annihilated. They're in the way, they don't have a soul, they have no right to exist. Terrorists act that way. Fundamentalists or people who are fanatical can act.
Yeah.
But sometimes people, as they increase, they may be more my group is right and most other groups or all other groups that don't agree with me are wrong. That's maybe slightly better, but it's still a kind of variation on dualistic thinking. And then as people start to develop further, that
Hmm.
they start to reach a point where maybe they begin to realize there are other points of view that are also valid besides their own. And sometimes you can take that a little too far and think that everything is equally valid at all times. But when you talk about the political climate, if people are at the mindset that my perspective is right and everybody who disagrees with me is utterly wrong, period. As long as people in operate at that level, then that kind of conflict is not going to go away anytime soon. Question though is it possible for us to rise above this sort of dualistic right polarization? Yes, it is. Joanna de Angelis stresses in, for instance, the book The Conscious Being, that we have the ability within ourselves, we have the equipment, if you will, to improve enough that we are quite capable of developing a much more deeper and sophisticated way of looking at conflict, our relationship to conflict, and that we are capable of being able to respect one another's points of view. When the Enlightenment came along, and this country was inspired by the Enlightenment, one of the things our founding fathers were very aware of is, of course, we weren't going to agree on a lot of things, but it was still important that we respect one another in spite of that. And it may be a very obvious thing to say, but how many people struggle with that?
Hmm.
I mean, here's a question. Why have people lost touch with the ability to respect one another, even if they have serious disagreements about things.
I think, if I may, and this is more of an opinion about this very polarized and immersed in conflict society that we, not just the U.S., but really the entire world is immersed on. It's the question of the uh, loss of a absolute measure of
Mhm.
what's right or wrong. So if you think in terms of, oh, I don't know, up until that age of enlightenment, God, right? God was the measure of all things. Therefore, there was this absolute obedience and tolerance to what was the divine, or so described.
Right.
With the Cartesian thoughts or Descartes coming in, there is this sense of a shift, a strong shift of it's no longer God that is the measure of all things, but our thoughts, right? Man is the measure of all things.
Mm.
Well, in this maybe 20, 30 years, this decade of an incredible speed to a knowledge, right? To inputs and outputs of anyone. There's this really amazing democratization to be able to be the source or the conduit of information.
Mhm.
Man stopped being the measure of all things because the measure itself is gone. It's all so relative. There is no way to say, oh, this is right, this is wrong. Well, based on what? So that really, right, Peter, exacerbate the conflicting notion that we live in, this highly, highly polarized. It's if I in that lower cognitive function of am I right or am I wrong, and now we're not going to get along, right?
Right. Right.
But I think it's important, if I may take a little bit to a very pragmatic example, Peter. In my world, we're talking about my professional world. Um, Conflict is actually something that is spoken a lot. We go through training, right, on conflict management. They're actually in the entrepreneurial world. There's so much written about conflict out there. If you just tell, just write down business conflict, there's this list, long, long list on what is conflict, how to manage conflict, how to resolve conflict, so on and so forth. But one of the things that comes to my mind in my world
Mhm.
is that conflict is not only good, but we should always do everything possible to open up, to monitor those conflicts, to manage those conflicts, but open up or create opportunities for embracing conflict as defined by that opposing views, right? So that we can become so diverse in welcoming people's thoughts, inputs, that we actually may be stronger, not pushing people away, but actually it's from the concept of inclusivity. Everybody's welcome to have their opinion. So it's a very interesting dichotomy in terms of the world of ideas and, of course, with, for instance, social media, etc., where I can be very abrasive in the anonymity of one post somewhere and get followers, etc., in that safety of I'm here behind a computer, nobody knows who I am, where do I live, etc., etc. So
Right.
you can become very instigating of opposing views for the sake of that. But I wanted to put all this aside and perhaps go back to some of the things that we talk about with perhaps psychology or depth psychology, transpersonal psychology, where in psychotherapies we're taught that it is really the process of psychotherapy is to keep going into that personal unconscious, right?
Mhm.
And by putting those conflicts that are there up to the surface, then we can create a sense of health and well-being. And
Mhm.
I love that idea. All of our ills and lack of well-being can be addressed if we are only able to open up in a way to bring up not only what is a personal unconscious, but potentially our shadow, right? Things that we are repressing, that we don't want to see, we don't want to talk about, we are judgmental, but it all exists inside of us.
Right. Well, it takes courage to do all that. We have
Yes.
to have the courage to face whatever our history has been, both
Hmm.
conscious and unconscious.
Yes.
And Joanna de Angelis stresses a great deal in stressing reincarnation. Joanna de Angelis stresses that
Hmm.
sometimes the conflicts we have are not only the ones in this life, but in prior incarnations as well. So there may be further types of work. I'm not talking about past life regression here, but rather when we think about our deeper nature, that it's something that has developed over a long, long period of time,
Yeah.
and we have the ability to find ways to face that. Speaking of transpersonal psychology, one of the people involved in that world, who's Ken Wilber, who focuses more on what he calls integral psychology. He
Hmm.
also uses the phrase "wake up" or no, "grow up and wake up," if I recall. Hope I have that right. I understand that the process of growing up and waking up is growing up would be developing more consciousness and awareness, but then in a transpersonal mode, in terms of transpersonal therapy, you
Yeah.
also have that awakening from
Yeah.
within, a deeper level of being, a deeper sense of who we are. And that requires, again, the courage to get past our own defenses, which
Our biases, right? Our own personal biases on what is comfortable, what's not. Yes.
requires flexibility. So going back to, conflict with others and needing to always be right, which is, basically a form of narcissism. Um,
Or at a minimum, an egoic driven force, right? I need to be right because the minute I'm not right, I'm diminishing my ego construct of who I am.
Suddenly my world is in jeopardy.
Yes. Yes.
Why? Why does our world have to be in jeopardy if we're wrong about something? Or maybe not completely right. And it's not a question of so and so is completely wrong and the other person's completely right. Because in terms of conflict resolution,
Hmm.
process where both people feel like they've been heard, and yes, they both have to make adjustments to how they see things, perhaps, or at least respect someone else's approach to things and their perspective.
And Peter, pivoting completely that, I think what you made me think here is knowing of your artistic background, right?
All right.
Uh-huh. You probably, I'm assuming here, you were probably trained to whatever you do in the artistic process of artistic development to really seek and adopt feedback, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Right?
Long background in theater. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I won't go through everything, of course, but just very quickly, I started off working backstage, which I enjoyed at the time, but then I became really interested in writing and playwriting.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing theater stresses a lot is that it's a collaborative art form. So when you're doing a play, just to focus on the creation of a play, yes, it starts with the playwright. The playwright, develops the story and the characters and does a process of rewriting and whatever research they may do and so forth. And they spend a lot of time on the play. But then there comes a point where you have to engage actors, a director, maybe do a reading of a play, which is not producing it, but just reading the play to see what you have or begin to see what you have. When we talk about play development, which sometimes is a four-letter word for certain people, but when development goes well, it means that the playwright is flexible enough to listen to the feedback he or she's getting, both from the actors, the director, perhaps, and anybody who may be participating. It doesn't mean you have to listen to everybody. It doesn't mean everybody's point of view is correct. The playwright has to be as truthful as he or she can to his or her own vision. But you also, maybe somebody will say something that's actually quite useful. If a playwright is deeply inflexible and controlling, then they may not listen to anybody. And what happens when we never listen to anybody? We don't grow, and chances are we also alienate others in the process. In new play development, sometimes there are times when, yeah, maybe all the feedback the writer's getting is not very useful, but they have to be open enough to listen to what people are saying and why they're saying it. So you really have to get out of your own head, and you
Yes.
have to learn not to be defensive.
And this is such a beautiful exercise, right, Peter? I often wonder, why is it so difficult for us to receive feedback or critique from others? And I often think that it's a question of we haven't been trained in our minds to be quote unquote wronged, right? To be defined as your best, oh, Marcia, your best idea. Mm-mm, not good enough.
Right.
And I think there are many new in organizational psychology field, many new authors that are talking about of this idea of feedback. Right? You have an idea, meaning this is your thought, and let's look at it as version one of a minimum version of five. So you start, throw it, all the stones that you can throw to just dilapidate, break down that initial idea. And what's survives is the good part. Let's do it again and do it again. And I love that idea, or the concept of we can think again, right? We
Yeah.
can even collaborate with ourselves if we go through this breakdown of thoughts into getting better. And maybe if we can flip it to us in terms of how we embrace conflict, how hard would it be for us if we think about us as being the little nugget that survived the really harsh critique and feedback, but we were really becoming not just a little piece of coal, but now we're becoming this diamond, this gem that has been really well polished, and take out any extras that it's no longer needed. And we would see conflict differently, right, Peter?
I have several thoughts, but let me start with this one by asking you a question because I'm guessing
Sure.
you may know this better than I do. In the business world nowadays, how much is creativity getting stressed?
Well, it's a good point, right? This is my opinion alone. I work for a global company, right? That the the biggest input for it is not capitalization or commercialization, is innovation.
Innovation.
So yes, innovation, right? It's even in the tagline of the company is innovation in you, right? Which is a really um, dichotomy, right? It's the innovation, and how does it impact you, or you as a second part of that innovation. And so when you say creativity is good, is really at the hallmark of the company wants to do,
Mhm.
but it is a company that is over 125 years old,
Mhm. Yes.
right? And so corporate, over 100-year-old, very large company.
Mhm.
There's a book there that has a title that I love to quote because it kind of represents that. It's a book, and I'm drawing a blank on the author, but it's the title was "Who Said Elephants Can't Dance?" And it was all about uh,
Right.
this is a 1990s book about IBM's transformation from, think about it, right? IBM, every employee was a three-piece striped suit and a very very specific type of culture, and he had to shift into become what it is today, a very agile, innovative, well adapted company that you can hardly recognize anymore, right? From olden days to today. And I think this is perhaps when you ask about corporate innovation, it may be the dancing elephants. Yeah, you can dance, but not so. So you're a dancer, so you know what I'm talking about, right? It's not with all the really elaborate, all the things that you can do in the dance floor, but it's very slow and the movements are quite perhaps cumbersome. But we do. It's what we put as the process. In from that perspective, collaboration
Right.
and invitation to conflict is at its heart, right?
Right. So when you say innovation, the thing that comes to my mind is innovation in terms of its connection to creativity. It has to do with, as you were saying before, finding the diamond within the
The rough, yeah, yeah,
right. That requires flexibility, as mentioned before, and it requires the willingness to abandon what we might have been doing in the past. I mean, I don't need to tell you, I assume that if you have a corporate culture that's very entrenched, well, we've been doing it this way for X
yeah.
amount of time, and why should we change this kind of thing? When people are like that, then they're obviously very comfortable in what they've been doing, even if the decay is happening underneath their feet.
Yeah, there's one word I don't want you to. I want to interrupt but not interrupt. Okay, the word that comes to mind is disruption. Right?
That's right. Yes, I've heard
True. Right?
architect.
True. Yes. True innovation is disruptive in its core. Right?
Right.
But go ahead.
Well, going back to playwriting, for instance, playwrights,
Hmm.
if they're any good, are should be willing to abandon a whole direction if it really isn't working.
Yeah.
Because the thing about writing a play, and I think it's similar to what you've been talking about in terms of corporations, if you're trying to do something innovative and you're starting at the beginning, it's ground zero. You have no idea where you're going to go when you're doing something from the beginning.
Yeah.
What direction is it really going to take? Maybe it goes off in this direction and there's good things about this direction, but it would be better if we kind of went over here too. It doesn't mean everything's fine and you can become wishy-washy, but it does mean that you have to pay attention to the organic process and allow it to go where it needs to go rather
Hmm.
than control it. That's part of it. And but just to kind of, I don't mean to contradict myself in what I'm about to say, but there's a
It's
quote.
okay. You're gonna be conflicting with yourself.
But I was thinking, well, the reason I say this is because I was thinking about a quote from Michelangelo.
Yes.
This is a paraphrase, but basically Michelangelo said, I see the statue within the rock, and I just have to chip away at it to get there.
Yeah.
So that kind of creativity could work too, where you have some idea of where you're going, and you just need to allow the process to get there. Whereas Picasso, I believe, spoke more about you start a painting and then the painting starts to speak to you. So there's this kind of exchange between you and the medium. That does
Mhm.
not imply that he knew exactly where he was going. In fact, I'm sure he didn't. But you see, both approaches can work, but it does require the right kind of flexibility to do so.
Yeah, that's absolutely amazing. Shall we
Mhm.
go back a little bit to, I don't know, something that you said, and I think I can quote to Freud as saying that suffering
Mhm.
is inevitable. Can we talk a little bit perhaps about this
Okay.
whole angst that comes from the fact that we are not yet in a emotional or psychological maturity that will lead us to live through all of the ebbs and flows of inputs and outputs, external and inner and internal influences to a place where we can master those the turmoil without touching us. And because we can't, we suffer.
Spiritism in stressing the immortal spirit,
Hmm.
basically saying it's not just spiritism, but to focus on spiritism, it is stressing that everything we need in order to get further along in our spiritual progress, it's impossible to do it in a single lifetime. And it also stresses that God has not given us anything that we can't really handle. So when
Absolutely.
we're struggle, right? If struggle's unavoidable, why do we have struggle? Well, do we not learn more deeply when we're directly involved in overcoming some kind of challenge or even just getting through a task? If you think about childhood education, I remember hearing it put this way: completing the task is a very important lesson. If you don't complete a task, suppose we go through life avoiding everything that's slightly difficult, then we would get in the habit of starting things and then never finishing them. Is that psychologically healthy?
Hmm.
Right? It's not. So when we learn to start a task from beginning to completion, whatever that completion is, again, theater is a great world in which you learn that lesson,
Yeah.
among many examples that one could come up with. But when you learn how to complete a task like that, of course, there are going to be lots of challenges, all kinds of challenges. The unexpected will inevitably happen somewhere along the way. And when we, um, like if you're trying to get a production up, you've got the play written, you've got the cast, you got the directors, now you got to get the thing on its feet. Inevitably, something that you didn't foresee is going to happen. There's all kinds of logistical challenges. And so problem solving is really, really key. Sometimes you can solve a problem fairly easily, and other times you're really stumped and you have to figure out how to do it. But the more we learn how to problem solve and overcome challenges, it develops confidence. It gives us a deeper strength that even if we have no idea how we're going to resolve something at the beginning,
Hmm.
nevertheless have enough faith and reasonable, healthy confidence that we're able to do so. Just to change focus slightly,
Uh-huh.
we have a distorted ego. We
Yes.
are developing an unrealistic expectation about what we can and can't do. That's not healthy. So there's a difference between a healthy ego and an unhealthy ego. A healthy ego would be where we can resolve a conflict, resolve a struggle, resolve a challenge, even
Yeah.
if we're reasonably confident that we can do so, even if we're not really sure how at the moment. And not knowing doesn't terrify us, because when we need absolute certainty in everything,
Hmm.
that's a false security. And it could be also that too could be a distorted ego, right? Because if I expect everything to be absolutely secure at all times, that means I want the world around me to operate the way I want the world to operate around me.
Uh-huh.
But we know that doesn't happen too often. But it doesn't mean, though, that life is always chaotic and we're always coping with chaos.
But it
But
is, right? But it is. So if you think about it, there's a certain amount of chaos that is inherent in the world that we live in.
yes, because when we talk about conflicts, one
Mhm.
thing we haven't talked about is if we think about our individual journeys, what kinds of conflicts are we attracting in our lives? What things within ourselves that we haven't really resolved do we nevertheless attract, which become a problem? When we
Right.
think about the kinds of people we attract, the kinds of relationships we attract, the kinds of situations we find ourselves in, is that
Mm-hmm.
merely completely random and capricious, or is it something about us that we've attracted certain situations because
I love that we that that tapestry that we weave just by the way we are, and the colors and the design comes through fruition
right,
as this chaotic, because it feels like there is no rhyme or reason, but in the end it has this beauty of its own, right, Peter?
and it could become less chaotic when we do use consciousness, to go back to consciousness, to
Yes.
understand, okay, why do I attract the same kind of person again and again and again in my life?
Ah,
What is it about me that's doing that? Can I free myself of something that maybe I do need to free myself of, so that I don't attract certain types of people who may, in this example, may be unhealthy? You could use this in a positive sense. Maybe we naturally attract people who are quite good for us, which is great. But what are we doing internally that,
yeah. So let's start to get to the same point, right? Why do we attract either the type of individuals or the same type of issues or conflicts in our lives, that we can see that pattern of behavior, right? And if we think in terms of some of the earlier discussion today from Joanna de Angelis, specifically in the book that you referenced, The Conscious Being, right? And we can see that Joanna de Angelis states that ah, this is not her, but this is going to be me
okay,
pretending to be Joanna de Angelis. By gosh, right? My gosh,
golly,
difficulties. Yeah, by golly, the difficulties and obstacles are actually quite stimulating to you, right? They bring you challenges. And if you remove those challenges out, you will be bored. You will settle. You will just be and end in a state of depression or disillusionment. And from that perspective, we can see that from all that we talked about, especially when we talked about, for example, in the arts, and how this feedback collection and collaborative approach, which is that approach of a diverse viewpoint of the material, we start to see that conflicts are quite important to us. Mentally and emotionally, though, Peter, those challenges really start to become an integral part of those development, right?
mhm,
Both mental and emotional, they become part of how the structures are solidified, and it helps us define our role in the social group, right?
mhm,
So I'm even thinking, let's say now, an example out of the blue, there is a tsunami or something catastrophic in nature, and which creates a challenge, right? It really is stressing that community. And yet, out of it, not only you learn from it, but there's something quite precious, which is the notion of solidarity, right? Where you start to see fraternity and love and solidarity within the community, and you start to see how the individual and the community both grow from that conflict.
right,
But when we talked about health, right, health and well-being, um, and this is for you to kind of come to a conclusion. Are we in the normal for us would be that we're healthy and well-being individuals,
right.
right? Even with those um, conflicts, because we should be able at some point to navigate with all of those things that are thrown at us
Mhm.
in a way that it's just another day. One comes and you have your little superhero shield that shields from the. It doesn't touch you because you are so emotionally mature that you can deal with it. Can you talk a little bit about it?
Well, if you go back to the example of what you were saying, suppose you had a tsunami or some kind
Yeah.
of
Hmm.
destruction of the community. And let's say this is a community we've been in for a long time. We're used to the structure of that community. We're used to the daily routines of that community. We've become very, very, very comfortable in the routines of our lives within that community. And then
Sure.
all of a sudden, boom, the community's infrastructure gets destroyed.
Yes.
Only the infrastructure. God forbid, maybe people were killed in it as well. But whatever happens, it is an obvious interruption, going back to the subject of disruption, but in this case, a very profound one. But what has really changed? Okay, the external has just changed and it affects the internal. It would be normal for people to be in shock. But as
Yeah.
you were saying, it also is a opportunity for people to come together if they're able to, if they have a natural instinct to be compassionate and charitable to begin with. If people are
Hmm.
just all very selfish, then things could go awry very quickly.
Yeah.
When people do come together, and of course it's a wonderful thing and a beautiful thing when that happens, it demonstrates that enough people are not so devastated by their attachment to the external
I see. Hmm.
construct, if you will, that they can't adapt. So, yeah, the community got destroyed. We have to rebuild. And it's going to take a while and it's going to be a lot of work, but we will do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it will not be the same. You know, I was just thinking, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I remember very much when I lived there, it was the center of the universe for me, right?
Yeah.
My brother and I like to joke about that sort of Bay Area narcissism, but not my point here. My point is this. The neighborhood I grew up in, which I really enjoyed a great deal, and I had a lot of strong emotional attachments to it. And I left that area when I was a teenager. By the time I was 30 or so, that whole area pretty much burned to the ground, including the place I grew up in, which my
Oh,
father,
sorry to hear that. Yeah.
also a house up the street that my father built, both long gone. So literally the only thing that I have of that is my memories, and I happen to have a lot of photographs too, which is nice. But if 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 any of us are overly attached to a particular environment like that, then we're acting as though life isn't fluid and life doesn't change. And to make a very basic fundamental point, we know that the material is temporary. Well, we do know it and maybe we don't know it. But in terms of overcoming conflict, a big one, which gets stressed in Spiritism, it gets stressed in Buddhism, among other sources, is to understand that everything that's material is simply on loan to us from God, so to speak.
Yeah.
And as much as we like it and as much as we can learn from it, it's not something to be ashamed of, but it won't stay with us forever. So, can we adapt and move on as needed? Which again goes back to what you were saying before about in a corporate environment, if you're working on a new project and you're kind of pulling from different resources,
Hmm.
taking what's good and getting rid of the rest. Um, Again, you have to be internally open enough, flexible enough, and have the confidence and faith enough that whatever the product is, it'll be fine.
Yeah.
Uh, You know,
No, it's
um,
just as you're saying this, and we're approaching the end of our time talking together, Peter. But what came to my mind was Joseph Campbell's several books, but the hero's journey, where he brings that concept, right, or the archetype of the hero
right.
in his journey, and the hero requires to be a hero just extreme adaptability, like you said, and courage and
Mhm.
patience and tolerance to all that comes his or her way.
Right.
And from that perspective, the hero journey is a metaphor to
Mhm.
this invitation, and I think this is an invitation that we can use with this discussion today, this invitation to look at ourselves, right,
Mhm.
to embark in this inner journey so that we can, like these transpersonal or depth psychology therapeutical process, which is bring about everything that is out there in this journey to confront ourselves. And by bringing up to the surface, we can then truly start looking, navigating those conflicts, but absolutely transforming our sense of health and well being, and transforming as well our ability to understand why we behave a certain way. Why do sometimes we are the perpetrator of extreme pain and
Mhm.
conflict ridden type of situations, right? But it's this invitation for all of us to have the courage to embark on our own hero's journey.
Right. And in his book, The Hero of a Thousand Faces,
Yeah.
Campbell stressed that one of the common themes or threads of the hero's journey is to want to refuse the journey.
Yes.
And it's an acknowledgement that it's okay to be fearful of certain things or to not feel that we're equipped for it. But then part of the hero's journey, as I think you were just saying, is
Yeah.
to have the courage to get through it and be
Yeah.
able to one day.
Overcome, right? The proverbial David and Goliath, being David so young, so small, and not a warrior, and having the ingenuity to overcome the, and that to me is a great passage, biblical passage, because it kind of makes it easy for us to understand we are often David, and it takes strength, but ingenuity, adaptability, courage. But it's the invitation for all of us to become the heroes of our own journey. But yeah,
Well, I know you guys sometimes like to quote movies. So,
uh-huh.
Indiana Jones, the first one,
Yes, yeah,
funniest moments in that movie, I think, is where, Indiana's doing this and doing that and overcoming this moment and that moment. And then
uh-huh.
I forget to who, but he says, okay, now we're going to do this and this and that. And then the person says, and then what? And he goes, I don't know. I'm just making this up as I go along.
I love it, right? So
Again,
the
it's hero's journey, right? Is
yes,
again, you have to be in the moment.
yes,
And mentioned me doing dancing. I do ballroom dancing. That's
yes,
exactly how it should be when it goes well. Is Yeah, you learn the choreography. Yeah, you work on the technique. But if things are going right, you just forget all that, get out of your head, and just flow from one moment to the next.
Oh, what a beautiful thing to say as we close on our episode today. Let us all be in the moment and be not just resilient to conflict, but welcome conflicts as the hero in our own journey. Thank
Right.
you so much, Peter. Thank
You.
you for being here with us today. I appreciate everyone and hope all of us have a wonderful time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here.